Good
Hi,
morning.
and welcome. Hi, Celeste, welcome.
Good morning. Welcome or afternoon or
Or
whatever
afternoon.
it is, wherever you are.
This is the great thing about meeting this way is we can just everywhere in the world we can get together and it's fantastic. It's very exciting.
So cool.
So for those of you that are joining us live today, we're going to be chatting a little bit about the thoracic sling with Celeste. And this is kind of her area that she obsesses over. I can say
It's
that
true.
because she just said
That's what I've
that.
heard.
So So as we chat today, I really want to invite you guys as our audience. We're here on Facebook for a reason, and that reason is to engage with you. So join the conversation, ask questions, comment, share any experiences that you've had or thoughts, theories, whatever it might be.
Yes.
Share them with us, chat with us, join the conversation. We're very happy to veer off in whatever direction you guys want, you guys need. This conversation is for you. So guide us and lead us in that. And yeah, I just see people rolling in. So
Great.
while we're waiting for everyone to join us, Celeste, please introduce yourself and your interest in the thoracic sling.
Yeah. My name is Celeste Lazaris, and oh man, I think when I first kind of honed in and got interested in the thoracic sling, I didn't know that that's what that was called. I'd kind of trashed my training business for a little while and just got into massage therapy full time and was like, okay, I want to figure out the horse's body. I understood that there was pain is valid and things like that. And most all of the cases that I worked on with the horses were neck and shoulders. And so I was just like, neck and shoulders, like there's a thing here that I really want to hone in on. And then over time of kind of obsessing over that area and trying to figure that out, then I learned that it was called the thoracic sling. And it was, very, very, very informal. I probably figured some of the things out that I play with now before I even knew what it was called. And then once I realized that and started diving into that, I was like, oh my God, it makes so much sense. And yeah, that's kind of how I got started. As a quick sidebar, where are you going to see people asking questions? Is there a thing on here? Should I get
Oh,
on my computer?
no, I can see people asking questions. There should be a little comment button at the top right of your screen. If it's not there, then I'll ask those questions.
Okay.
So we have a hi from Samantha. Hi, Sam. It's great to have you join us. Celeste, we've lost your camera. We've lost your camera there, so I don't know what happened. Um, but I think that's so fantastic, and it reminds me really of while I was studying, while I was in university, I remember my lecturer saying to me at one point that all of us will become either a neck person or a back person. We'll kind of gravitate towards one or the other of those two things, and it's been so interesting for me over the last few months. I've been really challenged in that there are neck people and there are back people, but there are also hoof people and there are also thoracic sling people. And so if you're something else, let me know. And it's really, we all have a whole body approach and we're all looking at the whole horse. So it's never that we're only focusing on one area. But Celeste put it really well earlier in that she said we can only obsess over so much, and we really become obsessed with kind of one area. And I think it has to do with what we can relate to and understand, or what piques our interest most, or where we get the best results. And I think that's generally how we end up gravitating towards one area over another. But they all have value at the end of the day, right? Like we can't discount the role of the hooves when we know nothing about them. It's the reality is they have a massive impact, even when we don't know what that is. So good morning to everyone who's joining us. I think most of you guys are joining in the morning, so it's great to have you. But we do have some Swedens. Hi. Ontario, Wisconsin. It's so great to have you all join us.
That's so cool.
Awesome.
I love the internet.
I love it. I love it. And Barbara says, Celeste, you rock. So great.
Thanks.
So let's jump into this while you guys all say hello. 11 p.m. in Australia. Sam, wow.
Sam, she's such a beast. This lady got off of, she did a 2-week clinic with me, which let me tell you, not very many people can keep up with me, in blitzing heat in California, 2 weeks. Then she stayed a little bit longer past that. And then she flew back to Australia. And then she was so excited about her horses and I mean, that's a long flight anyway. And so she didn't take a break. She just like pounded a bunch of coffee and went straight to play with her ponies. And I was like, oh my God, I love you so much. So good.
That's fantastic. Oh my gosh, I love it. No, Australia's time zone's always the worst to try and meet with. So we're glad you guys are here. Welcome. Okay, so let's jump into the thoracic sling.
Yes, ma'am.
Why is this area important for us to really understand to be able to successfully rehabilitate our patients?
Yeah. It's, you know, it's funny, we were talking earlier and you were saying how there's like people that are like neck people and back people. And I think that there's people that really, and I'm really good friends with the hind end people. And so it's always really funny because there's people that like, you have to rehab the hind end or the whole body fails. And I'm like, you have to rehab the front end or the whole body fails. And so our running joke is like, not who's better, but just kind of like playing with those levels. So mine is, so my general belief is that horses have 4 legs and they lead their spine from the front end of their body. And so when you think about it like that, and I kind of view the horse kind of almost like a train track system. And so if they're leading their body with the front end, if there's dysfunction in the front end, everything else is going to fail. And that's kind of just my general thought process on how that goes. I also very heavily believe in, I know one of the questions later on is like the fascial lines, but all the fascial lines run through the thoracic sling. And then when we go into proprioceptiveness and nerves, I don't know if there's anybody on here so I'm also a human therapist. And so and I did that school before I went to play with the horses. And one of the things, or before I started figuring this out with the horses. So one of the number one things that I treat in human patients is thoracic outlet syndrome. And so that's when our clavicle collapses into our first rib. We have a brachial plexus, just like the horses do. It pinches, you get numbness and tingling down your arm, pain up your neck, pain down your side. It's a pretty gnarly thing. And like 80% of my clients had it. And you can release it through massage therapy. If you don't understand body work, or good chiro doctors will be like, you have to get injections. And then there's the groups of people that are like, you don't need any of that. You can just do stretches and yoga and get rid of it. And so it's very similar to the horse world where you have like all of these different, this is how you handle the same thing. But when I started learning about that, and I was going back into remembering how every single horse that I worked on had neck and shoulder issues, I was like, I wonder if they have a similar thing. Because I didn't learn about that in bodywork school. We didn't really talk about nerves or anything. We just talked about like basic strokes and, you know, how to make your ponies feel better. And so I got a vet equine book. So it was different than mine. And it had all of the nerves listed. And I put it like side by side with one of my human books. I mean, and I went like off the deep end on it. And I was like, holy crap, like we have the same thing. Like we've got the same brachial plexus, we have lumbosacral plexus, the way that everything innervates into these things. And I was like, my like bread and butter for the human clients was this. And so then I started Googling and researching and trying to find anything that suggested something along the lines of equine thoracic outlet syndrome, and I couldn't find anything. And so, you know, I was like, well, maybe it's not real. But then I started playing around with the same manual techniques that I do on humans on the horses, and I started having just like wicked results. And so, and it's very similar to human. I mean, like if you've ever had a pinched nerve, like all of your muscles seize up around it. It's very painful. You get like almost this concrete feeling. And when you can kind of get some of that unwound, it just melts, and it's just immediate relief. It's so good. And so when I played around with that with the horses' necks, and I'll post pictures and videos of this every once in a while, but they'd be like concrete, just completely immobile, definitely like reactive. You touch them and they flinch and they freak out. And within like 15 minutes of just this gentle like nerve unwinding release work, there's just jello. The whole muscle just turns to a slab of jello. And I was like, this is so fascinating. And then we'd get horses that would have undiagnosed lameness in the front end. So they would block like kind of up to the shoulder, but they couldn't figure it out. So they'd ultrasound, they'd x-ray, they would do all kinds of stuff, and nobody could figure out what was going on with it. And then we'd create some space between the neck and shoulder and unwind the nervy stuff. And they'd go from 3-legged, like within 15 minutes, they'd go 3-legged completely sound. And I was like, that's like that's the branch that's like the numbness and tingling down our, you know, and it's just kind of trying to translate. And I do agree that horses are different than humans in a lot of areas, but when we start playing around, our education's better on humans. Like, and so if you can play around with the nerve stuff with that, I think it enlightens it. But So if horses lead from the front end of their body, and that kind of sets the tone for their spine and their haunches, and then they have significant nerve impingement in the front end most of the time. I would say the vast majority of horses that I work on have stuff going on in the front end, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit more as we go. But if that's happening and there's not health and wellness and integrity in the front end, you're basically just setting the entire body up for failure. So you can release and strengthen and do all the things you want with the hind end, but if this is crammed up and this is in pain, you're just kind of running the horse into a brick wall over and over again. So that's my general thought.
That's your general thought. I like it. No, it's not something I'd ever heard of. The impingement of the brachial plexus. So I think that and I think we don't think of it because there isn't that bony connection, right? We don't have
right.
Yeah.
But ours comes from our clavicle. I think that the horses comes from the scapula. And I can explain that in a minute if you want.
I do want. I was going to ask you, why do you think that happens? Why do you think the brachial plexus becomes impinged or restricted in horses?
So when I was working on, so a lot of this again was kind of translated from human techniques into the horses, and then just honestly intuition and messing around with my own horses. But what I found was the quickest way to get a horse to get release in that area was to do a lot of separation and fascial work between the scapula and the base of the neck. So you kind of like, and that's a pretty common, like a lot of massage therapists will work that part. And so there was really, I knew that there was a lot of, it's 6 a.m. and my words are failing me, but there is a lot of importance put on the creating space between the scapula and C6, C7. Like something about that really made just a deal breaker for the horses. And I was like, okay, and a lot of people have followed this thread. And so then I started looking at where the nerves line are, and the brachial plexus does sit underneath, like right in that area. And so I'm like, okay, so this is making sense. They don't have a clavicle, so ours gets pinched from the bony column. More honestly, what it gets pinched from is our scalenes get too tight, and so it pulls everything up. So it is more of a muscular dysfunction, but you can kind of quick fix it for a few minutes with a chiro, but it's a muscular dysfunction even with them. So I'm like, okay, so if we create space here, the stuff goes away, the symptoms go away. That's really neat. And so then I started playing around with abduction a little bit, and I'm like, okay, so if we're doing abduction with the horses and we can kind of get them like actually opening up through their body, that would create space. So if you're thinking about it more from like, okay, reverse engineering, I've had to rehab my body, I've wrecked a lot of street bikes and horses, and so I'm like, okay, so if we're rehabbing bodies and we're kind of restoring movement and space and gentle yoga, if we did abduction at the front end, that would create space. And so I saw a lot of success with that. And I didn't really know why. I was just in my head, I was thinking creating space. And that was a big change, I guess, for a lot of horses. And when this stuff started taking off. And then I was doing a clinic in Colorado, and I went down, if anybody ever has heard of Dr. Barbara Page, she's absolutely brilliant. And I was staying at her place, and we were nerding out lots about all different things because she's been doing this as long as I've been alive. She's just an absolute trailblazer of horses and women. And anyway, she pulls out this old book that she had in vet school, and she was like, I think that this would really interest you. And I was like, oh yeah, totally. So I'm clinicking all day, and then we get home and she gives me this book, and I'm looking through it, and I stayed up all night. I was trashed. I was on like 2 Red Bulls to do the clinic the next day because I was just like, this is it. Like, I was like, this is my holy grail. And what she gave me was an old fashioned, it's a book that has all these old fashioned cross sections of all the different horses. And so I think you shared, like, I saw that picture of the cross section. I had a girl repaint it because none of the numbers were in order, and it was really, really, really hard to read in the book. But I was looking at it, and there's a place in the book where it hones in on the infraspinatus muscle. And the infraspinatus muscle, when you look at it in the cross section, and it's hand painted, like the guy went through and did all, it's beautiful. And the infraspinatus has like a split muscle belly. And so it goes from the outside of the scapula to the inside. And one of the things that I noticed a lot in the horses that I worked on is you could see like the bony prominence of the scapula. Like infraspinatus, supraspinatus is completely, like, it's just not there. Very, very, very minimal. But we don't talk about those. We don't talk about those muscles because they're not a part of the thoracic sling. And so I come in and I argue and I'm like, they need to be, because that has everything to do with how we're kind of getting it all together. So anyway, so I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, so it's a split muscle belly. If it's super atrophied on the outside, which is where the fatty portion of that muscle is, and we're looking at it, I'm like, if I can see a scapula, it's not developed well. And that's the fatty portion of the muscle. So if that's not there, it's a good reasonable assumption to think that the medial side of that is going to be pretty atrophied as well. And the medial side, the way that it wraps around the scapula, so muscles work for actions, right? But they also work for different body mechanisms. And like, I really went down the kinesiology rabbit hole with humans, but I'm looking at it and I'm like, when you look at the muscle and the way that it's placed in, it really serves and this again is my opinion, but I think that it really serves to cushion the scapula against C6, C7, T1, and the brachial plexus, because it's right there. It's like the only line of defense between the scapula and that. And so if that muscle starts to waste away, there's not an actual cushion there between those things. And so as the infraspinatus developed and as all of that happened, then the horse got more cushion between those areas, and all of those sensations and all the nerve impingements went away. And it was, I mean, we're in like going up to probably 500 or 600 horses that I've played with this. Like it's not, in my opinion, it's not so much of a theory anymore because it works so well, but it's fantastic to see the way that you can separate the body from that. And, I mean, so again, they don't have clavicles. So you get in these horses that are super base narrow, or they have all these things going on. You can develop them out of that. We just kind of have to go in and target it and see it. But that's why I think that they have it, is because we don't train for it either. So it's not something that we talk about. We don't look at it. It's not part of any, vet's differential diagnosis, because it's not talked about. Yeah. So they have no idea what they're looking at.
Do you remember what that book was called?
I can send it to you. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I can send it to you. I have.
Okay, great. Because
I saved somewhere. Yeah.
I have this one. This is my favorite one, ABC of the Horse. Ooh. And if you guys, I don't know if you guys have it, or most people should know this one, but look, like there's basically a cross section.
Beautiful.
That area.
Mm-hmm.
My book just opened there now, so that was lucky. Anyway,
you're like this,
like this. Dr. Klaus's Anatomy of the Horse, says Samantha. Is that the one?
It might be. It's the.
We have some people from South Africa. Hi, it's great to have you join us.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, I'll find it and you can post it and I'll see it. But it was super rad. And the book was, it's just, and it had all these different animals in it. But yeah, it was really cool to look at something and be like, well, so, and then I came home and I looked up I have an equine rehab book, and I'm looking at it, and the infraspinatus. So, and it's really interesting. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but depending on what textbooks you look in, sometimes they'll say the actions of the muscles are completely different. And I'm like, this is interesting. So I've seen the infraspinatus and the supraspinatus be said that it does a few different things. And I'm like, this is okay. So I'm not really sure, but I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that when you work on abduction, the infraspinatus gets better. It develops. But the rehab book that I have here, and I'll send you guys a list of like the different books that I played with. There's 3 main ones that I really love. But that one says that the infraspinatus is responsible for abduction, and then the supraspinatus is responsible for extension. And so, but it's kind of like, if you look at it, it would be responsible for extension when the horse is in a little bit of abduction. So that makes sense. So playing around with those things.
It's so interesting. And I mean, as we're learning about the fascial chains and how the muscles connect with one another, it kind of also takes away that, well, this muscle goes from point A to point B, so it does X, because it doesn't only do that. It's also connected. It doesn't only do that. Yes. Exactly. So, I mean, that's so exciting as well to learn about. The possibilities it opens up is huge. We had a webinar series with Amy Hesbach on neuroplasticity not so long ago, which was, I mean, Amy is one of my absolute favorite lecturers, and she's a nerve person, guys. So I love that. And one of the things that she was talking about is that not in all cases, like very rarely do we want to go this route, but there are cases where you're not going to regain function. And that's when you want to say, well, let's train compensation and let's recruit other things to perform the same function. And because of the way that the body is created, we can do that. And it's really exciting in those cases.
You can't do that. And I got to listen to part of her webinar, and I need to go back and like, I want to talk to her so badly. If you're on here, please know I want to be your friend. Like, because there's so many things that put together for me that I'm like, okay, so like I train and I do these different things, and I'm like, I don't 100% understand why it's working for the neurologic horses, like horses that have neurologic components. And I know we're going to chat about that a little bit, but when I was listening to what she was saying, I was like, oh my God, that's why that works. Like, that's so cool. It was brilliant and validating, and she's just brilliant. So
no, Amy is absolutely, like I say, I learn so much from her every time, because we cannot separate the nervous system from the musculoskeletal system. They're integrally attached, right? You just cannot separate them. So it doesn't matter what you're working on and what you're treating, you're going to be working on the nervous system. And when we understand what we can do there, like it helps us to be more effective. And I really love that. So it's Amy Hesbach. Susie, you asked that. And it's Amy, AMIE. And you can find her on Facebook, and she's got a page, and she shares loads of neuroplasticity information, which is generally hard to understand. I'm just gonna put that out there as well.
Yeah, but it's worth diving down a little bit. I mean, we talked about it before. It's like there's like, well, there's neck people, there's back people, and I was like, well, it's because we can only really obsess over one thing, but it is a rabbit hole to go down. But it's brilliant, and it is necessary brilliance.
Definitely. And I mean, adding to that, we might be a neck person or a back person, but we're always whole body people. We're still treating the whole body. It's just the thing we're obsessing over. So I love that. So let's talk about neurological dysfunction, seeing as we're on that pathway, and how that kind of ties in with the thoracic sling and dysfunction there. Oh, wait, before we do that, Celeste, I actually had a thought while you were talking there about why we might get that compression and impingement that's similar to what we see in people. And I think that in horses, the muscles that are attaching that forelimb to the trunk are, I mean, they're 10,000 times stronger than what we have in people, because they have a much more vital function just in terms of keeping the horse upright. So if there is if there is restriction in any of those muscles, and it's compressing the scapula towards the trunk or towards the rib cage, then you would have compression there. So it's really about creating that space and creating movement between the scapula and the trunk without losing stability at the same time. And I'd love to add, because this is not something I've thought about before, the thoracic sling, it's not something that I've focused on really before, but as I was doing research for our interview and kind of just thinking about the things that you say and share, I have a young horse that I'm working who's quite narrow, and I've been really struggling getting him forward. And essentially there's really nothing wrong with him. He's beautiful, he's sound, he's not sore or uncomfortable anywhere, but he is narrow through his chest, and I have no forward button. He just isn't getting that. And I worked with him
really quick.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm super excited about this. So if I'm looking over here, it's because I wrote notes.
That's cool.
Because I have a brain injury and I'm a mom, and it's 6 a.m. So for all of those things, I have notes.
Sorry, I have notes too. Yeah.
So one of the questions was, what do you think the most common problem or missing piece is when there's dysfunction in this area? And so we talked about the infraspinatus. So my theory on why this happens and why, because it's, there was one trainer that I went out and I was working at, and every single horse, and most horses, this is like the first thing that I hone in on. And it's not because I only care about the thoracic sling. It's just because in my opinion, there's not, unless there's like an actual significant thing going on, there's really no point in doing anything else until you get that freed up. So I think the biggest misconception with horses and translating the thoracic sling, which I think is what got me this interview with you, because I don't usually comment on things. And I was sitting there and I was like, they're so close. And I was like, I don't think that that's it. And so I commented on something, and it was about the brachiocephalicus muscle. And so my unpopular opinion is that the brachiocephalicus muscle does not do what we think that it does. So when you look at the attachments, it says that it's supposed to draw the forelimb forward. And so in that theory, it's okay if there's a little bit of hypertrophy, because it should be drawing the limb forward and doing that. And there's a lot of discussion and belief around that. And I have found it to be the opposite. When there is hypertrophy in the muscle, or when the horse goes to use and engage the brachiocephalicus, because of the way that it ties into the front of the humerus, it essentially, the best analogy that I can come up with is like a starting gate. So, if it's tight, the head's central, right? Or the head's neutral to the shoulders. And so when it seizes up and it's tight, it pulls everything in. And so when horses have a hard time going forward, or when they're narrow, most of the time it's because, so when they're narrow, they don't have a lot of thoracic sling. So then what do they have to do? They have to go to their neck to hold themselves up. Predominantly the base of the neck, brachiosternocefalic, mostly brachio. And so when that's tight, it then collapses it in and it shuts them, and it makes them an inability to go forward. And so when I've found how to release it and then to send them forward through riding, so even get them to kind of soften to the contact and actually teach them how to turn that muscle off a little bit, what it does is it allows them to open that starting gate and to open their shoulders. And then all of a sudden you get extension. Not only do you get extension, but you get what I call the horse kind of more being in a receiving energy. And I think it's because they actually have somewhere to go. So if you can soften and open the front end, I did a demo on this with a horse that came to my clinic, but you can get on him, and if you can get him into that place, all of a sudden, he was upper level dressage horse. All of his buttons were there. He was very forward. We didn't have any of the stagnant issues. When I went to pick up on the contact, he kind of went to brace. That was his knee-jerk reaction. And so when I went to pick up on the contact and he went to brace, the shoulders collapsed. And it wouldn't have mattered how hard I kicked this horse. Not that I was going to, but it was that immediate, I have no forward button. I cannot do it. And then I would open and he'd boom, extension. And it was just, it's so cool to play with that. So there's that piece of it. So I don't think that it draws the forelimb forward. I think that it draws the head up and away from predators. I think that they're grazing animals, and that if you look at the attachments, also that the base of their skull and the upper attachments of the cervical spine is not strong enough to draw that big of a leg for it. It can't, like, that's not, it doesn't make sense in my head that works. But in canines, it's opposite. So if you've ever looked at the brachiocephalicus in a canine, because they also have one, they have a big, huge attachment up there, and a tiny attachment in the front of the forelimb. And that makes sense, right? Like, I'm like, okay, I can track with the canine one. I can't track with the horse one. But so the other thing then that plays in with the brachiocephalicus is that when that muscle is seized up, and I've played with this enough, both in hand and under saddle, to tell you, when they're using their neck, they cannot use their thoracic sling. So if they're using their brachiocephalicus, you have no access to their sling, or very, very, very limited. And so one of that's like a huge component for me. So when you're playing around with rehabbing it, and I know this is kind of like a little bit later on, but like that has to be a key component. And then if you think about how horses are in the wild, so I used to work with a lot of wild Mustangs, like actually in the range. I played around with the BLM and behaviorists and stuff out there. And when you watch them, the horses that have a really, really, really narrow sling and a really, really, really tight neck are the safest horses in the herd. They're safe. All of their vital organs are safe. They go around, they're like this. Like if they get taken down here, they're done. But if they get attacked and they're really developed here, they're okay. And it's the same thing for their psoas. And so it's really fascinating to see horses aren't meant to be ridden. They don't need a thoracic sling to do balance circles in the wild. They need everything to be tight and constricted, and their nature and their primitive nature is to go up and away and to keep that on lock. And then we take them and we decide to ride them and put them in pretty circles. But there's a disconnect there in how the horses naturally want to go for their instincts versus what we need them to do to develop their body. And it's totally fine. It's just we're not really mindful of that separation. Yeah. So that's why I think that happens.
I'd love to actually add into that, because we have a lot of endurance horses here, so we work a lot with endurance horses in SA. And one of the things that we know is that when when we have too much pain in the brachiocephalicus after a run, it's because they've been too fatigued. They've pushed past that fatigue point and they've been using the brachiocephalicus to run.
Yes.
And so it's not its primary function, but it can take that role.
It can take it.
Especially when you're going the distance and you need to go into that place.
Totally.
And what's very interesting is that I was chatting to someone who was at Forest Smith this last week, 2 weeks ago, which is our massive ride here in SA. It's a 200-kilometer endurance ride, so it's a big one. And she was saying, everyone's chest is just so narrow. They have these teeny tiny chests, and she doesn't understand how that works and why that is. So it's an interesting thing to just bring back into this conversation and how that how that ties in. So very interesting. But it's usually for me, it's always been, if there's pain in the brachiocephalicus, then that's a big kind of flag that they're using it incorrectly. They're overusing it. Something else is missing somewhere else, and now that somewhere else is the thoracic sling. So thank you, Celeste.
You're welcome. As a funny side note, so when I do gentle work with like at a walk, for instance, and I'm releasing the brachiocephalicus and I'm teaching the horse to walk without using that part of their body, the other place of the body that really gets to unravel and soften is iliopsoas group. So there's, whether it's from a fascial chain or something, there's some correlation between the brachiocephalicus and iliopsoas group working together. And I think that's really rad too. Because then one of the other first things that kicks on, so when you turn off the brachiocephalicus, it kicks on their thoracic sling. And then when you do that, it also seems to kick on their glutes. So their glutes and their iliopsoas group seem to work antagonistically, just like the thoracic sling and the brachio. And again, this is just all my observations, but it's really cool to watch the body and kind of watch what happens. And the other thing to throw out here, and this is just like my own, what really sparked this in me in terms of like the muscle groups and why I honed in on trying to get that muscle off, is because I have Andalusians, and primarily Andalusian stallion, and they're very, flirty with their movement and brawly. And when you watch them, when they're doing on their own, when they're playing and they're doing their big flirty, whatever showing off movement, the brachio is completely off. That's not ever on. It's the big fancy stuff that you watch your horses do and you're like, that's what I wish that they could do that in the show ring. Man, I wish I could call that up in her saddle. Like, we've all said it, right? We're like, oh God, if they could just do that. Like, look at that extended trot. I know that you have it in you. What's your problem? Why can't you do it in your saddle? Probably because we got in their way and their necks on. But all of that, when you watch their body, the brachiocephalicus shuts off and then it's like, boom, they have this huge sling. And I was like, oh shit. That's, and so you learn. I mean, I say it all the time, but like everything that I have learned, truly, I have to thank horses for, because they're such good teachers. Like, if you really watch the body and if you listen to their feedback when you're doing stuff, like they'll tell you every time. So yeah, so that's really cool. Those are my, why I think that is the way that it is. I think that they're instinctually not supposed to do circles and they do not need a thoracic sling. I think that it is the opposite. I think that they will stay alive if they don't use it. So I don't look at it badly. Like, when I see a horse that's completely upside down and ewe-necked, like, I've fixed all of those, but I don't look at them and be like, oh my God, they're so dysfunctional and terrible. I'm just like, wow, like, you'd be really safe. Like, that's a safe horse. Dysfunctional for circles, super safe for what it actually is. And so it's having that understanding of their body and what they are. So
super interesting. So guys, I just want to invite all of you, there are many of you here today, join the conversation, ask questions, chat with us. You're so welcome to comment, share your ideas, thoughts, and observations. That's what we're here for. So going back to my little guy, my youngster, I decided to give it a try. I'd been reading some of what you were saying, and I came to the conclusion, okay, I just got to create some space in his thoracic sling. I spent I think half an hour doing some nerve releases in those forelegs and creating space, and boom, big open chest. And the next day I rode him and he was taking off with me, and I was like, okay, well, maybe there's something here.
Look at that. Yes, that's so good.
Anyway, yeah. Then I was obviously like, oh, the brakes. I haven't had the opportunity to train the brakes yet. It was great.
There wasn't a need for the brakes. Yeah, that's a thing. Another thought too, and this is where like I laugh with my hind end people about it. So I'm like, so here's my, again, if you go back and you're like, okay, horses have 4 legs, they lead from the front end of their body. If there's a lot of hypertrophy in the brachiosphalicus and they cannot extend fully because they're C's up here and they're collapsed in. So anytime that they're pulled into a little bit of abduction, if you lose abduction, you lose extension. And so if that's going on, they don't have full extension of their limbs. And there is, I mean, obviously there is conformation and there is a skeletal structure to the horse. And just like humans, there's a natural gait that we're all like, your natural gait's going to be different than my natural gait. And that's your walk. And so our bodies are healthiest when we have full range of motion for the gait that we are built to have. And that's why when humans like go on crutches, or if you limp, it's really detrimental to your hips and other things because it just ruins everything. Gait is a big deal. So when you can restore true extension and true gait through the front limb, what you do then is you're creating space for the hind end to actually do the same. So most of the hind end dysfunction that I see, in my opinion, comes from the fact that the front end has been shut down because it's been seized up. So then the stride immediately shortens. Well, the hind end it's not going to go past that. Like we do have some horses that will overreach and do that for a little while, but eventually that goes away too. Cause and some people think that's a good thing. I'm like, that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing when they stop overreaching, because at that point they've gotten so dysfunctional in their hind end because they've had to shorten their stride back here to make room for the front end. And so as you restore that functionality in the front end movement, then the hind end can actually get its true swing. And then when the full body has the gait that it's supposed to have for the structure of the conformation. And again, I mean, there's so many things where the fascial chains kick on, but that's another, and then you get sound horses. So you have horses like, oh man, they have all this really wonky movement. We don't have it. The minute you restore full gait, the horse's body, and I'm sure neuroplasticity comes into this too, but the whole body is able to kick on and restore itself. And it's so rad to see that it can be that simple.
It can be that simple. That's the frustrating part. Sometimes it's like so simple and we feel like,
why did I overcomplicate this so much?
Anyway, we have a great question. I'm so glad Romy asked this. I'd love to hear more about the overlapping and connection with the fascial lines that you guys touched on before. I'm going to actually put that up. I'm excited about this because, Romy, I don't know if you're in the Online Pet Health membership, but we have, I did a research refresh on the fascial lines, and we've done one on the deep ones and the superficial ones because who is it now? Vipka Albrandt, she published articles on both of those, the deep lines and the superficial lines, that are very in detail and very in depth and extremely interesting. So we covered those in research refreshers. And I'm going to be honest with you, when I went through them, I was really focusing on the lines that were connecting pole to hoof through the body. And the spiral lines and the lateral lines, which we do, right? And the deeper lines connecting into the visceral organs, the viscera. And that kind of, like that component between locomotion and the lines connecting into your organs, and what that means. And it's all very mind-blowing to me. Again, it's still very exciting. But again, preparing for this, I was thinking about, hey, there are forelimb lines that I wasn't thinking about and that I wasn't focusing on. And the forelimb lines are on their own. They're lines on their own, but they overlap with the other lines. So over to you, Celeste. What would you like to tell us about that overlapping and connection with the fascial lines?
So the first thing that I'm going to lead with is I am not in any way, shape, or form educated enough on the fascial lines that I feel like I'm going to give this justice. So I'm going to throw this out there.
Me neither.
I was actually talking to my sister about it last night because, again, because you were very kind, and you shot me some questions, and you're like, here's kind of our general thing. I'm like, okay. And I'm like going through, and we got to the fascial lines one, and I'm like, there's so much there. And it's not because I don't believe in it or want to dive into it. It's just it's not been my obsession yet. But and I know that when I go into it, I'm going to be like, this is just a whole nother, it's so freaking brilliant. But one of the things that we were playing with is, so all of them do run through this thoracic sling, and the way that the body moves through space, like I do genuinely believe that there is kind of a one set correct way for a horse to move in terms of balance and being on a bend. As far as a riding horse, like there's a way biomechanically correct for the horse to go. And what I see in the body is when it's doing that, all of the fascial chains are working together the way that they should. And I think that that's why that there's horses that, like, they seem really, really, really wonky, but then when you can kind of put them into this framework, the whole body, the whole meat suit just kind of like relaxes and works the way that it's supposed to. So there's a lot of truth there in the way that it works. And that's when we were talking in the beginning, and you're like, it's like, here's the muscles, and here's like the actions and things that they're supposed to be doing, but then here's the fascial chains and what they can pull off. And it's like, it's brilliant. But another thing that we were playing with is that, there's my notes. I'm going to go back to my notes. Is playing around with like the nerve lines and the proprioception. So fascia is brilliant, and fascia is kind of your body's, it's definitely more part of the nervous system than people give it credit for. I know you guys don't know this, but like in terms of humans, and we talk about it, I'm like, your fascia is like the last line of defense for your nerve. So if you have a proprioceptive issue because of your nerve, and then, your fascia is basically it. So it can kick on to play with that. And so when you understand that, like, many horses become like, they'll get really stiff in their fascia as a way to kind of compensate. And that's why when you release the nerve impingement, all of a sudden the body can kind of kick back on and go with fluidity. And so I think there's a lot of, when we're dealing with nerve impingements, and I think that we deal with it a lot more than people realize, between the brachial plexus and the lumbosacral plexus, the fascial lines and the fascial chains are the things that have to kick on to support the body in a way that they probably shouldn't. Kind of like the brachiocephalicus can do things that it should, but it's not supposed to be that last line of defense. If that makes sense. But yeah, that's kind of my general thought on that.
That's kind of your thought on that. I'd love to just throw in as a sideline thing that, if we're thinking about the fascia and we're thinking about that role in those connections, and especially with the nervous system and its role in the nervous system, then we have to also consider the emotional component of
Ding, ding, ding,
fascia. Well, it's just, we're not going to go into that, because I just think
we don't even have time.
We don't have time, and we don't know enough about it. But if you guys want to learn more about fascia, Tulia Luamala did a 4-part series for us, which is also in the Online Pet Health members portal, where she goes into fascia. She doesn't go into the lines and the chains, but she goes into understanding fascia, and that would be the beginning. And then, the research is out there to look at the lines as well, so that's cool. Okay, we have another question. Oh, this is a good one as well. I'm curious to hear about horses that are not narrow, but more low and heavy in their chest, broad between the front legs, as if the chest has fallen down. Often these horses are heavy on the forehand and will mangle you when leading them, and have a tiny butt. Oh, yes, and have a tiny butt. Okay, sorry.
I totally
mangle.
I actually have one of those horses in rehab with me right now. Yeah, he's got a brilliant, huge chest with he just looks like he has really big, saggy, superficial pectorals, but he's very heavy, and he doesn't mean to be, he's not unkind in any stretch of the imagination, but he is very, kind of runs you off the path when you're leading him, and he just kind of accidentally bulldozy. And it's the same thing for those horses. Like, he doesn't, I think that there are horses that have the superficial pectorals, but that doesn't mean that they have a sling. And so when we play around, so just as like a quick breakdown of like my own methodology when I'm playing with stuff. So the first thing that I'll do is teach the horses how to kind of mindfully turn off the brachio so that I have access to the sling. And one of the core muscles with the sling that I play a lot with for the second level would be the serratus muscles, both cervicis and thoracis, because those are your muscles of a half halt. And when the horses don't have adequate pectorals, and they don't have an adequate trapezius, and they don't have adequate serratus, they're just going to go down. And so they're either going to go down and be really on their forehand forward, or they're going to go down and then panic and then kick on the brachiocephalicus and go inverted. It's going to be one of the two. So it doesn't matter if they go on the forehand, if they go behind the vertical, or if they invert. The answer to all of those questions is that where their center of balance is, which it should be like around between the 6th and 7th rib, those muscles, so deep pectoral, serratus, trapezius, are not developed accordingly. So, I mean, it's the same plan of attack for that horse as it would be for all the other ones that we're playing with. It's truly developing the full set of the thoracic sling so that the horse can actually lift itself up and have balance. And then at that point, when the horse is developed up in the front end, and they can call themselves up and be in balance, not only do they have integrity of their spine and how they move through space, but then they have the ability to, when you do ask them to drive from behind, they have somewhere to go. So you're not driving and pile driving them into the ground, which is a big theory. Is like, okay, well, everything, you get them up and back and tipped on their haunches. Well, yes, and they should only be on their haunches when they can also hold themselves up on their front end. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
All right, thank you. We have another one. Thanks, guys. Keep the questions coming. We're going to cover them. So when the thoracic sling becomes better functioning, will it spread to the hind? I think my Icelandic gelding also has something going on in his hind legs as they point together in his hocks and his toes are pointing out.
Yep. So one of the things that I see with that, so again, I generally start with the front end just to make sure that there's somewhere to go, so that then when we are addressing their hind end, we're not kind of running into a wall. Most of the time, and that's a really common symptom. So they'll kind of be narrow up front and then they'll be rotated in behind. And that's where, when I mentioned that I think that there's a connection between the iliopsoas group and the brachiocephalicus, because as we teach them to kick on their thoracic sling without the brachio, their glutes kick on and their iliopsoas calms down, and you see all of that kind of go out. So they go from being like this behind to actually releasing on their own, which is really cool.
Okay. Hannah, before I get to your question, we're just going to address this one. Can you repeat what the half-halt muscles are again, or possibly spell them out for me, please?
My opinion on what the muscles of the half-halt are the trapezius, full set, the serratus muscles, so the serratus ventralis, cervicis, so the ones that come up from the neck, and then the thoracis, the ones that kind of insert down to the ribs and lift them up, and then the deep pectoral sets would be the ones that I personally think are the muscles of the half-halt.
Okay, awesome. All right, here's a big one. Hannah asks, I'm interested in the connection between posture and the mind. So there we go.
Here we go.
By training horses to be healthy in ridden work, developing the thoracic sling and switching off the brachiocephalicus, what effect would that have on their nervous system and their emotional state? For example, if the brachiocephalicus is a protector muscle, by switching it off, are we potentially causing mental or nervous system unrest because we're effectively weakening what their primeval brain relies on as their defense?
So I actually love this question, and I really, really love that she called them a protector muscle, because that's exactly like what I call both that and the psoas muscles. So what I have found to be true, one of the things that makes this really difficult is you cannot force the brachiocephalicus to turn off. Now you can have a lot of you can do a lot of mindful horsemanship stuff, and you can do a lot of stuff at a standstill, but if the horse is scared, if the horse is not feeling safe in its environment, if the horse is not feeling safe with you, if you try to force the head down with rigging or anything that's not their idea, the brachiocephalicus will not turn off. You can only force it off really by kind of talking them into it at a halt. Everything else, the horse is going to kick it on its own. And the reason why, I know it's not part of the question, but the reason why that's really important to note is it makes it really, really difficult for us to rehab. It's the number one thing that you're going to come up against when you're trying to rehab the sling, in my opinion, because it is not easy to be that mindful with the horse because it's a protector muscle. The way that it impacts their emotional state is actually for the better, as far as I've seen it so far. I've never seen it impact it in a negative way. I've only seen it impacted in a positive way. Because horses that go around with that seized up, just like humans that go around with a really heavy posture. So people that go around and they're at the computer and they're kind of sunken in, they're like this, and they never get to open that back up. They have a lot of the times what we'll call a heart chakra problem, or they'll have different emotional states of being like this, or the people that, they go around and they're like this, and you're like, just just put it down. Like, you're okay. I mean, like, we've all had it. Like, I've had people totally tell me that too. They're like, put your shoulders and not your earrings. When you have different postures affect humans and horses, and I'm sure other animals, postures affect your emotional state always. And when you unwind that, you can get into a better emotional state. So what I have found with rehabbing the thoracic sling is actually the opposite. So all of horses that come in, and this is kind of across the board with my clients, they'll come in and they're hypervigilant, and horses aren't supposed to be hypervigilant all the time. They're supposed to have like a little bit, but they're also supposed to be in a herd environment where they feel safe. Like they don't actually go around going all the time in the wild. That's not, they do it like when we go up in their space or when there's a predator, but for the most part, they're really chill. So when you have horses that are like chronically spooky, they either have stuff going on with that brachiosphalicus and or there's like an ulcer issue is usually the two. And on a sidebar with that, my vet and I have played a lot with when there's issues with the brachiosphalicus muscle, there's a correlation with ongoing gut health, whether that's the vagus nerve, whether that's because they're having nerve impingement, whether or not it's because that's the muscle that keeps them in that like fight or flight mentality. And then when we get them to release that and have a different posture, the reoccurring ulcers go away. So it's just kind of a cool thing. So it actually does the opposite, is it will calm the nervous system and it will kind of put them into a place of relaxation. It doesn't ever take away, the brachiosphalicus is rad. Like, you can have a horse with a completely loose one that goes around, like the ones that I have that I train all the time, like it's loose all the time. It's floppy when they're in their pasture. They move around. Their general state is pretty good. They can absolutely turn that on when something comes in and freaks them out. There's a pack of coyotes that run in. You better believe that sucker is up and they're going for him. And so I think that it's the opposite. I think that it helps their mental state. I know that was a really long-winded question, but I felt like there were a lot of points there that I had to say. I hope that answers it.
I think that was good. And I agree. It's not, they are prey animals, so they're always aware, but they're not going around always ready to run. Okay, no, you covered that really well. So Christy wants to know, what are some ideas or exercises that you use to rebuild the thoracic sling? And that ties in with my question. So potentially you could cover them both together.
Yep.
Of what are some of the tools or techniques that you found to be most useful or successful when you're treating this area?
So the first thing, I'll just kind of throw the general disclaimer that I think all of us throw out there is there are contraindications for everything that you do with a horse. And so having like really baseline exercises for everybody that has a thoracic sling issue, like please make sure that your vet and your body worker and people have like, somebody has looked at it and been like, there's not other things going on. The number one thing that I would say across the board is something that you guys can play with the other exercises that you do, is if you just start learning how to turn off the brachiosphalicus and kind of getting them into that place, I can talk about that a little bit, where they feel safe turning off that muscle. Then what you do from there is you just kind of go through and you ask them to do different ranges of motion that all of the thoracic sling muscles do with actions. And you're just asking them to do that with the brachio off, and you get access to it. It's really rad. I generally avoid doing downhill stuff because the downhill compresses into the sling and then they go to use the base of their neck. And so anything downhill is kind of tricky. I know some people will do like backing up hills. I'm not generally a fan of those things. But anything that you do with the brachio off is going to help you with that for sure. So, and then in terms of like how to do that, what I have found is there's kind of a certain sweet spot for every horse for where that muscle turns off. And it seems to be completely dependent on the development of their trapezius. So you have horses that have really, really, really well-developed traps. The headset will be a little bit higher. And I don't want to say headset because it's not a set, but the placement of the head will be higher for where that muscle can turn off if they have developed traps. If they have really atrophied trapezius, their head needs to be quite a bit lower. And so what you do is you just kind of play with your pony and you feel the tension where the brachiosphalicus is, just in general, when they're like up and looking around. And then you just gently ask them to soften to the contact, and there'll be a particular place where you'll feel it and it'll turn completely off. If they go much lower than that, it'll kick back on the upper attachments. So you'll get some at the base, but you won't get it all the way up at the upper attachments. And then they'll turn it off a little bit so you get some access, but you're not going to get a full range because then they're going to use their pole as a lever for their body for balance instead of coming back to their serratus. And so trying to be mindful that you have that is going to be really important on that. But I call that pillar one with my work, because everything that you do builds on that. If you can do that, pretty much you get access to the sling, and that's your key.
So did I understand that right? You're basically going to ask you're going to feel for that tightness in the brachio.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to ask your horse to lower their head until you feel the softening and the switching off. And then at that point, you're going to do some movement and ask for...
You can ask for walking, you can ask for lateral, you can ask for a little gentle backs. I mean, anything. And it's the same for riding. Like when you're doing riding stuff, having that being a key player. And I'm a big believer in doing some isolated abduction work for sure, because I want to target that infraspinatus, because I want the scapula up and off. I want it developed to cushion and push off of the brachial plexus, and C6 and C7, T1, all of that whole area.
Okay, I love it. I love it. So really being mindful of what's active and what's not active, and focusing on that brachiocephalicus. Guys, are there any other questions or comments or thoughts that you guys would like to focus on? Celeste, from your side, is there anything else that we've missed that we want to talk about? I think we've basically covered most of it.
I think we've covered most of it. The only other thing that I'll throw out there is, one of the questions was, is there's dysfunction in the area, what's the neurological impact on the patients? And that is, if they don't have access to their shoulders, so if they're supposed to lead from the front end of their body, especially around a bend, when they're going into it, they should have access to their shoulders. Anytime you do a circle, you should be about 15% of abduction at 15 to 25%, humans and horses, so that you can keep everything balanced and upright. If you don't have the muscles of abduction, so if you don't have trapezius, infraspinatus, you're going to be stuck more in adduction. So then you have horses that will tightrope around corners. Like that's a big one. If you let your horse loose and you just kind of watch their general range of motion, if they go to tightrope and are stuck more in adduction than natural balance and abduction around a bend, there's kind of a clue in that there's a problem. When they don't have consistent access to their shoulders around bends and they're doing lots of circles, most of these guys will start developing a neurologic pattern. And I don't mean neurologic like they have EPM or something. I just mean they've had to come up with a pattern of, I don't have access to this to make this happen, so I'm going to go to my hind end instead. And so then what'll happen is you'll get horses that you'll be riding, and sometimes in hand too, you'll ask for right shoulder and they give you right hind, or you ask for left shoulder and they give you left hind. Then they're like, well, they're really just noodly and fishtaily. But what's actually happened is something has gone awry, and they have lost confidence in the front end of their body. And so they've created a neurologic pattern in their mind to say, I'm going to do this with my hind end instead. And then that really messes up the whole system and the fascial chains, because they're not supposed to lead from the hind end. And so when they go to do that, there's quite a bit of disconnect. And then when you have horses that have chronic fishtailing, not only do you have that neurologic component of they're not actually speaking to their independent forelimbs the way that they're supposed to, and those independent fascial lines are really, really important. So when they're not talking to those lines, the other thing that happens is they kind of jackknife through their low back, that lumbosacral plexus area. And now you're dealing with sciatica, and that's either going to give you catastrophic explosions where it just kind of comes at random, but it's not. It's usually when the haunch leaves the line of the forehand, and or lameness in the hind end, because now we have that numbness, tingling sensation going down. So, and I've had many horses fail neuro exams that when we've rebuilt the muscles through the spine and taught them that they have access to their shoulders and not their haunches, the neurologic components, I guess, so the neurologic symptoms completely go away. So there's a lot of truth to what's going on. You know, again, restoring the gait and restoring the fascial chains to what they're supposed to be doing. If the horse is leading from the front end of the body appropriately, it won't fishtail, it won't mess up that lumbosacral plexus, and we don't have as many neurologic conies. It's also, however, we have a lot of EPM horses, which is really cool.
Okay, so we have now got a bunch of questions.
Okay.
Always the case.
Where'd it go?
All right, let's go. So Christy says, thank you. I have a Clydesdale cross and a rescue that I do massage and PMF as well as kinesio tape, taking of the thoracic sling, KT of the thoracic sling. He overuses his brachiocephalicus. Stretching. Should you be doing stretching?
Let's see. I don't personally do a lot of stretching. I don't Nope. I would say just to try to turn his brachio off and take him for walks in a straight line. And we're talking like maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Like, you don't want to, and that's another thing to really talk about too, is if horses have been using their brachio, if there's a lot of hypertrophy or their general motion is that they're using that, I'm going to take a quote out of my sister's book here, but you're essentially taking away their cane. And so you want to be really gentle when you're doing that. So starting at a standstill and letting them practice what it feels like to turn that off. Some horses can't even do it at a standstill. They'll do it and they'll be like, oh my God, I'm going to fall on my face. That was really scary. Like, be really mindful with them and go really slow and give them an opportunity to kind of clue in. You can take it off a little bit, ask for a really gentle shift back, and help them find those muscles. They don't want to do it on their own. They're also prey animals. So activating atrophied muscles is not what they're going to do, because then they're going to showcase that they're weak, which means they get eaten. So when you're doing this work, being really mindful that you're going very slow. If you are turning it off and taking them for walks, and again, most horses will stop on their own. Like, they'll put on a stop button and be like, hey, like, I can't do this. But really making sure that you're going slow and you're not manipulating them, because, when you take it away and you're kicking on these thoracic sling muscles, if they've not used them for a long time, it'd be like me asking you to drop and give me 50 push-ups right now. It's like, you really want to be mindful of what you're doing and how long you're doing it.
Okay, fantastic. Hannah asks, what about a horse that's not able to lift itself in the front? Where and how should one start with helping that horse training-wise, taking for granted that the horse is sound? And then she added, not lifting from the base of the neck.
Yeah, I mean, everything that we just said, it would be the same thing. Yeah, I would start with, if they can't lift from the base of the neck, it's because, and I probably need to get better about coming up into words, because that's a big thing. It's like there's two big things on, like, the horse's head needs to be, like, the pole needs to be at the highest point, and the horse needs to lift from the base of the neck. But where in the base of the neck is the horse lifting from? So we can argue that the horse needs to lift from the serratus, the cervical portion. So that would be at the base of the neck. But it's not going to do it on its own. It also needs the thoracic portion, and it also needs the deep pectorals. It's a whole thing. And so it's not the neck necessarily that does it. It's the sling that lifts the base. So kind of understanding that. And then if you're really focused on training pull at the highest point, which I know she didn't say, but it's just worth mentioning because that's a big belief. I don't disagree with that. That's the goal. But there's a lot of horses that do not have a developed enough sling, specifically a trapezius, to have their pull at the highest point without the brachio turned on. So you need to take the time to slowly build that up so you have that higher head placement so you can do that. So that's a little bit of a dichotomy that you got to mess with.
Definitely. It's not, pull at the highest point is not the starting point. It's we get there. And then Haley asked, what are some abduction exercises or examples of abduction exercises?
I mean, lateral stuff is great. I mean, that's all it is just asking the horse to take one step of an abduction. So you can, soften the neck, ask for them to kind of come back into their body, and ask for them to step up and out. So just isolate that limb.
Love that. And then that develops into lateral work, like yielding or shoulder in or out, or whatever the case may be as it develops. I love it.
Yeah.
Christy says his thoracic sling has been looked at by multiple vets and muscles keep deteriorating. How can I build muscle in this situation?
So I don't know if we touched on it. I know we talked about it a little bit in the beginning when my camera was flipping out. But another thing to mention with the sling is really, really making sure that you're taking a look at their feet. And when I say, and I'm going to say this with all of the love and kindness that I have in my heart, that does not mean your farrier's interpretation of your horse's feet. So my suggestion for people would be to always get x-rays of their feet. You want to see what's going on in the bony column. And then posting pictures of your horse's feet in different places and trying and really going, because that's a whole nother rabbit trail that we don't know about. When there are 3 primary nerve lines that are going down. So if the muscles of the thoracic sling are not kicking on, it's going to be one of 3 or one and all of the above, in my opinion. If I have a horse in personally, and this has happened, if I have a horse in personally and I do everything exactly right and everything that I know has always worked and nothing is changing, it has always been because there's something going on. There's an imbalance in the hoof. And so figuring out what that imbalance is going on in the hoof will then translate. So 3 of the primary nerves that come out of the brachiocephalicus, on top of the fact that the feet are the foundation for the body. I mean, we'll just start there. But 3 of the primary nerves that come out of the brachiocephalicus or the brachial plexus go down and they innervate into the hoof. And so if there's an imbalance in the hoof, whether it's the bony column, the full hoof stimulation, and or like the balance of the breakover point, and this is a very, very, very broad spectrum. I am not a farrier. I'm not a hoof expert. This is just what I know from my people that I work with. There's going to be a disconnect in the way that those nerves innervate back into the shoulder. And if the nerves are not firing correctly, if they're not kicking on, if there's any dysfunction in there, the muscles that those nerves then innervate can't talk to the body because it's not kicking on. There's also the potentiality of, if he's not working his thoracic sling, like go back and play with, turning off the brachiocephalicus. Is there a reason why he's not doing that? So if you're doing it very slowly and correctly, I would start there and see. If that's not working, I would check in with the feet. And if that's not working, I would check in with a body worker and make sure that he doesn't have significant impingement through the shoulder and the neck, to make sure, because if there's a lot of pain there, they're not going to want to kick it on. So check with the pain, with somebody that knows how to do that nerve release work, check the feet, and then try to do it very, very gently with the brachiocephalicus off would be my suggestion.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy. I hope that helps. Paula asks, are you finding a connection with the tight brachiocephalicus and the teres minor?
Yeah, there's definitely a correlation. Yep. Yep.
Wonderful. Quick, sweet. Yes.
Yes.
Tracy asks, how often do brachioplexus nerve releases
It's so hard
on average? My brain just read that.
I know.
How often do the nerve releases need to be done on average until they develop the cushion under the scapula?
It depends on the horse. It depends on how the horse is being worked. It depends on how the feet are. And that one is horse dependent. If the feet are good and the horse is not being ridden incorrectly, they don't typically need more than 1 or 2 nerve release sessions, in my opinion, unless they're like super eunuched. Like if you have a horse that's like really, really, really bad, those ones, I would suggest doing it more often. But just in their general case, if all of those boxes are checked, you typically don't need too many, in my opinion, or in my experience.
Awesome. Christy says, thank you. Another question. You don't have to apologize, Christy. You're very welcome to ask questions. How can we approach therapy for the neurological system? We have a KT application that decompresses the muscles in the pole. What else can I do?
I don't know too much about KT taping or how to do that. I would say to maybe message Amy. That's right. That's her name. That has the yeah. I would message her. I would message people that more so specialize in the neuroplasty and that stuff.
Perfect. And if you want to know more about specifically kinesiology taping, we have so many webinars on that.
Perfect.
So
even better.
Go into
I don't actually know anything about KT taping. I know that it works really well. I don't. That's not my. Never played with it.
Yeah, and I mean, if our goal is to, deactivate the brachiocephalicus, there are absolutely kinesiotaping techniques that can help us achieve that and do that. So it might be a cheat for us to be able to do that. Although I do think it is very important to still come from a correct movement perspective in terms of the way we move, the way that the horses move needs to be what's helping switch that off. But we can certainly help that with kinesiotape. Okay. And then Susie says, can we translate this to the human body? And what would it feel like in a human body to release the brachiocephalicus? And how would that shift our own movement? Sometimes it helps to sense it in my own body to understand it in the horse, if translatable. A good question.
So when people come and train with me, I have them do 2 different things. I have them all read The Body Keeps the Score, because it's a brilliant book about fascia and emotions and how all of that plays in, because I do think that that's really important. And the other thing is I tell them to go and get worked on by a structural integrationist, whether that's Rolfing. I do body Zen therapy. There's Heller work. There's all kinds of different practitioners. But if you look up structural integration where you're at, you'll probably find somebody that does that. And you can ask them for I mean, they'll do everything, which is amazing. But if you ask them specifically to do work for like thoracic outlet syndrome or psoas scalenes is what I would suggest doing. That would be the best thing to start for A, understanding kind of what's going on in the horse's body, and then B, that's everything for humans. So on a quick note for people, so the way that our system would work for the brachial plexus stuff is it's the scalenes come down and it attaches into the diaphragm. And when our scalenes in our neck get really tight, it goes and it crimps up and it pinches our first rib into our clavicle. And that's where a lot of that comes from. Now, you can just go in and release the neck and the shoulders, except for there's usually a reason why your diaphragm is pulled down. So sometimes the scalenes are like really, really tight, but the diaphragm can also be pulled down this way because your psoas has crimped up. And so if your psoas is too tight, which and almost there, I don't think there's been a body on my table that I've not had to do psoas release work on. So that's just a general thing. When you release the psoas, you release the diaphragm, which then decompresses the scalenes and gives you it's a whole body thing. And then that restores functionality in your low back and your pelvis and your movement and your gait. And yeah, that's a whole thing. But that's what I would suggest doing. And it's brilliant and everybody should have it done.
So the book that you mentioned, is it called The Body Keeps the Score?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah.
So there you guys have it. Romy posted it. The Body Keeps the Score. I'm going to look for that.
I'll throw a disclaimer that it can be a highly triggering book. It talks about all kinds of different trauma. So if there's stuff that like you don't want to read about trauma, like maybe skip that. But it is extremely mind-blowing both for horses and for humans, and just understanding the role that fascia plays in memory and emotions and all. It's brilliant. It's so cool.
I think it's really important for us to understand that trauma can be held in the body and in the fascia.
Oh, yes.
It's so important. So important.
So important.
No, for sure. Okay, so one more. I think this is a very good one for us to end with. Tina asks, how can we learn to do the nerve release therapy aside from the pillars? So Celeste, will you tell us about how people can learn from you if they want to do that, please?
Yes. So this year I'm going a little bit slow because I just had a baby in February. So I have my first clinic back in California where usually I clinic every month, and I teach and I offer that. So I do nerve release stuff in person, and I haven't figured out a way to teach it virtually yet. Every once in a while, there'll be a body worker or a vet that will just do a lot of Zoom sessions, and I'll try my best to make them my hands, and we'll go through it. But I have found there's just nothing really replaces that in person, like both being able to demo what it looks like and then putting my hands on your hands and helping feel the touch and the pressure and all of that. So the best way to learn from me would be through in person. My website's going through a bit of a revamp right now, but if you go to wildmagicllc.com, there's on the homepage, there's a place that you can subscribe for my email list. And as soon as all of the courses and the clinics and all those things get launched, it automatically sends an email to let you know where to find it. So that would be the best way to do it for now. And I promise that there's going to be more. We're just playing this year a little bit slow, but we're gearing up again in fall. Basically clinicking while breastfeeding is a challenge, but
shocking revelation.
Shocking revelation. But I am trying.
Well done. No, well done. That's awesome. Okay, we'll do one more, but this will be our last question. So okay. Hannah asks, you mentioned the iliopsoas being another important element. Please could you expand on that and maybe explain how this muscle can be helped, developed, or supported too?
Yeah. So most of the time I think I've only seen maybe once or twice ever that the iliopsoas muscle needed to be developed more, or the muscle groups, I should say, needed to be developed more. Usually they're overdeveloped, just like they're overdeveloped in the brachiophagus, and they're almost hand in hand. Horses that have a little bit of that roached back, usually that's too much of an there's compression there, and there's hypertrophy in the iliopsoas group, specifically psoas minor. And again, when that happens, you get lumbosacral plexus issues, so sciatica, so on and so forth. So I wouldn't necessarily say that there's anything to support and strengthen there except for mobility. And it's the same for humans. Very often, very rarely, unless there's an injury, do we need to strengthen our psoas. We need to have mobility. I think that there's a big, I don't want to say misconception, but a lot of people, and this isn't directed at the person asking the question, but a lot of people are like, okay, like we want to make everything stronger. And really mobility is the better answer there. Mobility is the better strength. And so a lot of the times when I see these horses come in, they are too strong. And so what we want to do is we want to kind of decompress and give that psoas room to breathe. And again, that comes, I have found it to be true that almost all of the time when you can get that brachio off, get them using their body in a healthy way without it, they also kind of turn down that iliopsoas group, fire on their glutes, works it out. Also, same in horses as it is with humans, the psoas runs into the diaphragm. And so when you have horses, again, that they're having breathwork issues or even coughing and things like that, a lot of the time it is coming from the diaphragm. So when you release the brachio and the iliopsoas, you get more breathwork with the diaphragm, and it's just a whole horse beautiful component. Glutes fire on, whole 9 yards. So I don't know if that 100% answers your question, but I would go for more mobility than I would strengthening, and I would do it like that.
All right. I love that. I love that. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us live. And thank you to Celeste for joining us and for sharing your experience with us. As we wrap up, I really want to just say, Celeste shared something earlier on Facebook about, just that sometimes we don't feel confident speaking out and we get shut down for that. And I want to challenge each and every person that's here with us today. I want to challenge you to never stop learning. I want to challenge you to always ask yourself why. Never stop doing that, guys. Come on. Always seek a more effective way. Always, no matter how good you are, how effective you are, continue to look for a better way. Always ask if there are ways in which we could be doing things better or differently. And as you're doing that, I want to challenge you on the opposite end of the scale to believe in yourself. Because just because there is a better way and you don't know it yet does not mean that what you're doing and what you know doesn't have value. So trust your clinical reasoning, trust your knowledge, trust the horse that's in front of you and that process that you're going through with your patient, and trust yourself, believe in yourself. You guys are amazing. We do amazing work. And so often we sit where we doubt ourselves. We're unsure about our abilities. We doubt whether we're doing the right things and are we in the right place and is it worth it? And, we see all the challenges in our industry and the questions we don't have answers to yet. And I hope that you guys are encouraged and inspired by the fact that if we continue on that path of just always questioning, always learning, we will get there. And that is all we can do. That's good enough. So thank you. Thank you, guys.
Totally.
And join us for the Vet Rehab Summit on the 12th of November, where we're going to be focusing on exactly this. Our theme is excellence and leveling up. And we're going to be focusing on the things that we don't always think about, like our mindset and our confidence and imposter syndrome, and filling the knowledge gap. So it's going to be an uncomfortable one, and it's going to be the best thing that you can do. So I look forward to seeing you all there.
Yes.
All right. And if there are any questions going forward, if you guys are watching this as a recording, post them in the comments and we will swing back and answer those in the comments. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.